They mocked the quiet Navy SEAL on Frostpine Hill until the night Cedar Hollow froze, and only his strange wooden tunnels kept the town alive. When the wounded veteran and his loyal K-9 began building covered frames from his lonely cabin toward the old schoolhouse, neighbors laughed, teenagers filmed him, and the whole town called him the soldier building a maze. But when the ice storm came early, when firewood turned useless, generators died, children cried in the whiteout, and families stumbled toward the cold, every mocking voice went silent. Because the man they misunderstood had not been hiding from the world. He had been preparing a miracle God would use to save it. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Cedar Hollow, Vermont, rested beneath the Green Mountains like a town that had learned to speak softly whenever winter leaned close. Its white church steeple, maple shops, narrow storefronts, and wood smoke-stained houses gathered around a creek already carrying a skin of ice, even though October had not yet surrendered. On the morning Ethan Walker drove in from the East Road, the sky was dull pewter, the pastures were silver with frost, and the wind came down Frostpine Hill in uneven breaths that made the spruce tops bow as if listening for orders. Ethan saw the weather before he saw the people, the low birds, the wrong angle of smoke, the sharpness in the air, because years as a Navy SEAL had trained him to read terrain before conversation, and years after coming home had taught him that conversation often turned into judgment before truth arrived. Ethan Walker was 38, tall and lean, with close-cropped dark blonde hair, pale gray eyes, a scar along the left side of his jaw, and the quiet posture of a man who could enter a room without seeming to disturb it, yet still know every exit inside it. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Ranger, his 7-year-old German Shepherd K-9, broad-chested and sable-coated, with a black mask over his muzzle, amber eyes, and ears that turned toward every faint vibration in the truck cab. Ranger had served with Ethan overseas, trained for tracking, detection, protection, and the deeper invisible work of pulling Ethan back when memories crowded too close, and as the pickup passed the Cedar Hollow welcome sign, the dog lifted his nose to the vent and tasted the wind like a soldier, reading a battlefield. The cabin on Frostpine Hill had belonged to Ethan's uncle, Samuel Walker, a retired lineman known in town as stubborn but useful, tall, sunburned, silver-haired, rough in speech, kind in action, and always first to repair a neighbor's generator when storms came through. Samuel had died the previous spring, leaving Ethan 12 acres of timber, a sloping gravel road, and a cedar cabin with a sagging porch, patched metal roof, smoke-blackened chimney, and windows overlooking the valley. In the lawyer's envelope, Ethan had found a note written in blocky handwriting. "This place saved me once. Maybe it can save you." He kept it in his wallet, not because he believed places could save men, but because some tired part of him wanted Samuel to be right. Ranger jumped down the moment Ethan opened the door, landing softly on frost-whitened grass, then swept the yard in a slow circle, while Ethan stood beside the pickup with his duffel over one shoulder and watched the land reveal itself. There was a woodpile near the back wall, a narrow trail toward the lower road, pines too close to the roof, and a shallow drainage ditch crusted at the edges, each detail taking its place in Ethan's mind like points on a map. Ranger checked the porch steps, sniffed the old door, paused at the tree line, then came back and looked up for confirmation. Ethan nodded once and said, "Yeah, buddy, this is home now," though it sounded less like a fact than a promise made to the dog, to his dead uncle, and to the broken part of himself that had come here hoping the mountains would ask fewer questions. The first neighbor slowed before Ethan had carried the second box inside, a red Subaru creeping along the gravel road with its window lowered halfway. Behind the wheel was Margaret Lewis, a widow in her late 60s, thin, sharp-eyed, and wrapped in a gray wool coat, the kind of woman who brought soup to the sick, remembered church birthdays, and still distrusted strangers until they proved they would not bring trouble. "You must be Samuel's nephew," she called, trying to sound welcoming while her eyes moved from Ethan's scar to the military duffel and then to Ranger, who had stepped between them without a growl, calm but blocking the path. Ethan answered politely, "Yes, ma'am, Ethan Walker," and Margaret gave a careful smile, told him Cedar Hollow was a good town, if a man respected its ways, then drove off slowly enough for Ethan to understand that the story of him had already begun moving downhill. By noon, the story had reached the post office, diner, and Miller's Hardware, growing larger each time it was repeated, and Clara Bennett heard it while sorting winter notices beside the counter. Clara was 34, medium height, slim but strong from lifting classroom boxes and moving desks alone, with chestnut hair tied in a loose braid, thoughtful brown eyes, and a calm voice that made children feel safe, even when adults disappointed her. She taught at Cedar Hollow Elementary, the old two-room schoolhouse near the creek, and had spent months trying to save it from closure after the town board decided repairs cost too much. Her father had once been the school janitor, a quiet man who believed a school could hold a town together when money, weather, and grief tried to pull it apart. And after losing him during a bitter winter, Clara had become gentle with frightened children, but quietly fierce with careless adults. The loudest voice in town belonged to Mark Hollis, owner of the hardware store, 45, broad-shouldered, red-faced from cold mornings and strong coffee, with thinning brown hair under a seed company cap and a laugh that could make others join before they knew whether the joke was kind. Mark was careless more than cruel, a man who treated caution like weakness, unless danger had already knocked on his door. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, sat in Clara's class, small and serious, always drawing dark clouds in the margins of her spelling sheets, which made Clara listen harder when Mark told the men near the store stove that Samuel's nephew had arrived with a war dog and a stare like he was expecting an ambush. A few people laughed, then glanced toward Frostpine Hill, and Clara felt frustration rise, because Cedar Hollow needed unity if the school was going to survive, but instead, the town had found a new stranger to turn into a rumor. That afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Brooks drove up Frostpine Road after 2 calls from neighbors who said the new man seemed intense, which in Cedar Hollow usually meant quiet, unfamiliar, and hard to place into a comfortable category. Daniel was 52, broad but softening at the waist, with a trimmed gray mustache, tired blue eyes, and the patient manner of a man who preferred preventing trouble to performing authority. He found Ethan behind the cabin, studying the slope, ditch, pines, and cloud line above the green mountains as if measuring danger no one else could see. Ranger stood at Ethan's left side, ears forward, body still. "Just checking in," Daniel said, and Ethan answered with controlled politeness, explaining that he had inherited the place and wanted quiet. Daniel found no threat and no crime, but drove back down carrying the uneasy impression of a man who watched the weather like it was speaking only to him. By evening, Cedar Hollow dimmed under a blue-gray sky, and smoke from the chimneys drifted sideways instead of rising, a small warning most people missed as they closed curtains and turned toward supper. Down at the schoolhouse, Clara stayed late taping plastic over a cracked classroom window while the old furnace rattled behind her, and she looked once toward Frostpine Hill, wondering whether the strange veteran everyone was whispering about might understand what it meant to protect something before anyone else admitted it needed saving. Up on the ridge, Ethan stood on Samuel's porch, with one hand resting on Ranger's head, watching heavy clouds slide down from the green mountains, lower and darker than they had been that morning, while the forest beyond the cabin held unnaturally still. Ranger gave a low rumble toward the trees, not angry, not afraid, only warning, and Ethan's jaw tightened as the first hard pellets of ice ticked against the porch rail, because he had come to Cedar Hollow searching for quiet, but the mountain was telling him winter was coming wrong. By the next morning, the ice that had tapped against Samuel Walker's porch rail had melted into thin silver trails across the steps. But the cold had not left Cedar Hollow, and when Ethan Walker stepped outside before sunrise with Ranger at his side, the air felt tighter than it should have, as if the whole valley had been wrapped in invisible wire and pulled hard from both ends. Frost covered the cabin roof, the old woodpile, the low weeds beside the drainage ditch, and the windshield of Ethan's pickup, while the green mountains stood in the distance under a pale, bruised sky that carried too much weight for an ordinary October morning. Ethan wore a faded navy work jacket over a thermal shirt, old cargo pants, and brown combat boots worn soft at the creases, his face still carrying the quiet exhaustion of a man who had slept with one ear open, while Ranger moved ahead of him in a slow patrol, the 7-year-old German Shepherd's sable coat catching the dawn light and his black-masked face turning from the trees to the road and back again, never nervous, never careless, always reading the world the way Ethan had taught him and the way war had sharpened in them both. Ethan did not start with the cabin door or the porch or the obvious repairs any ordinary man might have made first. Because ordinary repairs were for ordinary winters, and the signs around Frostpine Hill no longer spoke of anything ordinary. He walked to the old woodpile behind the cabin, measured the distance to the kitchen wall with long, even strides, then measured again, from the woodpile to the drainage ditch, from the ditch to the gravel road, and from the road toward the faint downward trail that eventually curved toward Cedar Hollow Elementary. From the truck bed, he unloaded cedar posts, crossbeams, rope, iron brackets, canvas tarps, and a stack of weatherproof markers, placing them in neat groups that looked random, only to someone who had never built a survival route under pressure. Ranger sat beside the first bundle of posts, alert and silent, and each time Ethan paused to check the slope or the wind, the dog's ears moved with him, as if both of them were listening to instructions coming from somewhere above the mountain line. The first post went into the frozen ground with a clean, hard crack that echoed through the pines, and by mid-morning, Ethan had driven 12 more into a curved line around the cabin, leaving enough space between each upright for airflow but not enough for heavy snow to break the line cleanly. He set the second row closer to the woodpile, then framed a narrow covered passage between them, low enough to resist wind, high enough for a person carrying firewood to move through, while bent slightly forward, and strong enough, if finished correctly, to shed ice before it crushed the supply beneath. To the eye of a passerby, it looked like the beginning of a strange wooden tunnel, something half barn, half barricade, half the work of a man trying to keep the world away, but in Ethan's mind it was a map of need. One section to keep fuel dry, one section to guide hands along rope in whiteout, one section to shield the old road where the wind always drifted deep, one section that might someday mean the difference between someone reaching shelter and vanishing 10 feet from safety. By noon, the rumors that had begun the day before found fresh wood to burn, because Margaret Lewis slowed again in her red Subaru, this time with her mouth parted in open confusion, and two teenage boys on bicycles stopped at the bend below the cabin. Skinny, restless boys with winter hats pulled too low, and the kind of nervous cruelty that came from wanting to impress each other before understanding the harm of their own laughter. One of them raised a phone, not quite brave enough to step onto Ethan's property, while the other called out, "Hey, mister, you building a maze for your dog?" Ranger rose immediately, not lunging, not barking, only placing himself in front of Ethan with his shoulders squared and his amber eyes locked on the boys until their laughter shrank into awkward silence. Ethan did not shout at them, because boys who mocked from roads were not enemies. They were weather, unpleasant but temporary. So he simply picked up another beam and turned back to the work, letting the hammer speak in measured blows that rolled down the hill like a slow warning. The loudest laugh came later, carried up the gravel road inside Mark Hollis's green pickup, and when Mark stopped near the ditch, he leaned out the window with his seed company cap tilted back, his broad red face creased with amusement, and his heavy hands resting on the door like a man who believed any place in town was partly his stage. "Well, I'll be," he called, eyes moving over the posts and half-covered frame. "Samuel's nephew really is building something." "What is this supposed to be, Walker? A fortress against alien invaders?" Mark laughed at his own line, loud enough for the teenage boys farther down the road to laugh again. And even though Ethan kept his back turned, his jaw tightened just enough for Ranger to notice. The dog gave a low rumble from deep in his chest, not a threat but a boundary, and Mark's smile flickered before he forced it back into place. "Relax," Mark said, lifting one hand as if innocence had been proven by volume alone, just trying to understand why a man needs wooden tunnels around a cabin before Halloween. Ethan finally looked at him, and there was no anger in his face, only the flat steadiness that made careless men uncomfortable because it gave them nothing easy to push against. "I'm preparing for winter," he said, and Mark snorted, glancing at the sky, as if the sky belonged to him too. "Winter comes every year, Walker. We stack wood, we salt steps, we complain until March. We don't build covered trenches like we're expecting the end of civilization." Ethan lowered the beam into place, checked its angle, and answered without raising his voice. "Then you have been lucky." For a moment, the road went quiet, and Mark looked as though he wanted to say something sharper, but could not find words that did not sound smaller than the cold moving between them. He spat lightly into the gravel, muttered that Cedar Hollow would have a fine time with this story, and drove downhill, leaving behind the shape of his laughter long after the truck disappeared around the trees. The sheriff arrived in the afternoon, just as Ethan began anchoring rope along the first covered run, and Daniel Brooks stepped from his cruiser with his coat collar raised, his gray mustache beaded with frost, and his tired blue eyes moving slowly across every post, brace, line, and bracket. Daniel was not a foolish man, and that made his uncertainty heavier, because he could see precision in the work, even if he did not understand its purpose. "Ethan," he said carefully, using the kind of voice meant to calm a horse before it kicked, "I've had 3 calls today and 1 blurry video from a kid who thinks you're building something people ought to worry about." Ranger stood beside Ethan's left knee, still and watchful, while Ethan tightened a bracket and said, "People worry when they don't know what they're looking at." Daniel sighed, rubbing one gloved hand over the back of his neck. "Then help me know. Is this a barricade? A defensive structure? Something military?" Ethan glanced toward the tree line, then toward the road, dropping toward town. "It's a winter frame," he said. "It keeps wood dry, holds guide rope, breaks wind, spreads snow load, and gives people a path when visibility goes bad." Daniel listened, but the town's fear was already standing behind him, crowded and impatient, and Ethan could see the sheriff weighing a veteran's expertise against the comfort of people who wanted every strange thing explained in familiar language. "Forecast says light snow later in the week," Daniel said, not mockingly, just cautiously. Ethan drove the last nail into the bracket and looked at the clouds gathering above the Green Mountains. "Forecasts are useful until the mountain stops cooperating." Daniel's mouth tightened, because he had heard enough grief in Ethan's voice to know there was a story beneath it, but not enough permission to ask for that story. "Just keep it on your property for now," he said, "and maybe don't scare folks." Ethan gave a humorless half-breath. "I'm not the one scaring them." Ranger's ears shifted toward town then, and Daniel followed the dog's gaze as if expecting to see the valley answer. But there was only the pale road, the leaning pines, and the half-built tunnel casting long ribs of shadow over the frost. Clara Bennett came near sunset, walking up from the lower road with a folder under one arm and a wool scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her boots dusted white from the frozen shoulder, where the school bus usually turned. Unlike the others, she did not stop at the property line or raise her voice from a safe distance. She waited until Ethan saw her, then lifted one hand with quiet respect, and Ranger, after one careful glance at Ethan, allowed her to approach within speaking distance. "I'm not here about the rumors," Clara said, though her eyes moved over the wooden frame with open curiosity. "I'm here because the school roof leaks over the east classroom, and the board keeps delaying repairs. I heard you knew construction from your uncle, maybe from service too, and I wanted to ask if you could look at it before the next storm." Ethan studied her for a long second, seeing not just a teacher but a woman carrying too many responsibilities in shoulders that refused to bend, and then he looked past her toward the valley, where the old schoolhouse sat low near the creek, but protected on 3 sides by slope and timber. "That building sits in a pocket," he said. Clara frowned slightly. "Is that bad?" Ethan shook his head. "Not if it's reinforced. In a hard storm, it could be one of the safest places in town." He went down with her before dark, Ranger pacing close at his side, and when Ethan reached Cedar Hollow Elementary, he saw immediately what Clara had feared and what the town had ignored. Cracked flashing near the roofline, a weak-back awning over the wood bin, old windows that would bleed heat, and a side path that would vanish under drifting snow within an hour of true whiteout. The schoolhouse itself was modest, white-painted, 2 rooms deep, with a bell above the entrance, and children's paper snowflakes already taped inside the windows. And Ethan stood in front of it while Clara explained budgets, board votes, and the possibility of closure, in a voice that remained steady, only because she had practiced not breaking in public. He said little, but his mind was already extending lines from the cabin to the woodpile, from the woodpile to the road, from the road down toward the school, imagining covered guide points, reinforced bends, rope anchors, and storage shelters that could move heat and people through a storm. When he returned to Frostpine Hill after dusk, he added 3 new markers along the lower edge of his property, not toward his own porch this time, but toward the trail that led to Clara's school, and by morning the town would see the strange wooden tunnels reaching farther downhill, which meant the laughter would grow louder, the calls to Daniel would increase, and the rumor of the soldier on the ridge would spread faster than the cold wind he was trying to outrun. The night after Ethan Walker marked the lower edge of his property towards Cedar Hollow Elementary, Frostpine Hill settled into a darkness that did not feel empty, because every tree seemed to hold the cold in its branches. Every seam in the old cabin seemed to breathe against the walls, and every half-built wooden tunnel outside stood beneath the moon like ribs of some unfinished creature, waiting to be given purpose. The town below had gone quiet, except for a few yellow windows scattered along the valley road. Yet Ethan knew quiet could lie, and as he sat alone at Samuel Walker's kitchen table with a lantern burning low, his weather notebook open beside a mug of coffee gone cold, Ranger lay near the door with his sable body stretched across the floorboards, his black-masked face turned toward the cracks beneath the threshold, where the wind slipped in thin and sharp enough to touch memory before it touched skin. Ethan had meant to review measurements, to compare the slope of the road with the anchor points he had set that afternoon, to decide how far he could extend the covered guide path before the town forced him to stop, but the longer the wind moved along the cabin walls, the more the room seemed to thin around him. He was still 38, still in Vermont, still inside his uncle's cedar cabin, but the sound outside changed shape in his mind, becoming not the Green Mountains but another range far away, a frozen line of black peaks where radio signals died in the static, and men learned too late that cold did not need bullets to kill. His hand tightened around the pencil until the wood creaked, and Ranger lifted his head at once, ears rising, amber eyes catching the lantern glow, because the dog knew the smallest changes in Ethan's breath, the way other dogs knew a thrown stick, and this was no ordinary restlessness. The memory came without asking permission, pulled through the cabin by the draft beneath the door, and Ethan saw the old mission again with a terrible clarity. A temporary camp high in a mountain pass, canvas shelters hammered into frozen ground, fuel drums lined beside a rock wall, his unit waiting out what command had called a minor system. There had been 7 men in that forward position, each one with a name Ethan rarely allowed himself to say aloud, and among them was Petty Officer Caleb Ross, 29, broad-smiled, freckled, always joking about opening a barbecue place in Texas, a man who made others laugh because he had grown up in a house where silence meant trouble and humor had become his way of keeping fear from entering the room. Beside Caleb had been Marcus Hale, a quiet medic with narrow shoulders, careful hands, and a habit of checking everyone else's gloves before his own, and when the storm came down faster than the reports had promised, those 2 men were the first Ethan remembered seeing disappear behind sheets of ice-white wind. At first it had been practical, the kind of emergency soldiers knew how to answer with orders, ropes, inventory, checks, movement, but then the weather turned violent with a speed that made training feel small. The fuel got wet when a storage cover tore loose. The backup shelter collapsed beneath ice. The radio carried only broken words, and the cold came into everything, into boots, gloves, weapons, water, thought, until even breathing seemed like work done through broken glass. Ethan remembered carrying one man under his arm while shouting into wind so loud it swallowed his voice before it reached his own ears, remembered Ranger younger then, only 4, leaner, faster, still carrying the hard confidence of a K9 who believed Ethan could solve every danger if they kept moving. But there had been too many bodies, too little heat, too much distance between what should have been and what was left. And by dawn, the mountain had taken men who had survived gunfire, explosions, and months of danger, not because they were weak, but because nobody had prepared for cold as if it were an enemy. The lantern flame flickered, and Ethan was back in the cabin only halfway, his chest locked, his pulse hammering without rhythm, his eyes fixed on the door, as if the storm from that other mountain were about to push through Samuel's old wood and fill the room with white. Ranger rose silently, crossed the floor, and placed his muzzle against Ethan's knee. But when Ethan did not respond, the dog moved with trained certainty, climbing partway onto the chair and pressing his weight against Ethan's thighs, then higher against his chest when Ethan slid down to the floor as if his legs had forgotten the present. Ranger did not bark, did not whine, did not panic, because this was work too, as real as tracking through rubble or guarding a convoy, and he settled his warm body across Ethan's sternum with careful pressure, grounding him in fur, breath, weight, and trust until the cabin walls returned one by one, the lantern, the table, the notebook, the smell of cedar, the frost at the window, the sound of Vermont wind, instead of another mountain's last warning. Ethan inhaled once, ragged and shallow, then again with Ranger's nose pressed beneath his jaw, and when his hand finally found the dog's neck, the tremor in his fingers made him close his eyes in shame, though Ranger only leaned harder, accepting the truth without judgment. "I know," Ethan whispered, his voice rough enough to scrape. "I know, buddy." He stayed on the floor a long while with the dog braced against him, and when the worst of the panic loosened, he turned his face toward the dark window where the unfinished wooden tunnels stood in the moonlight, misunderstood, mocked, and necessary. "They think I'm building it for me," he said, speaking to Ranger because the dog was the only living thing that had earned every word. "They think I'm hiding from them, or preparing for something that won't happen. But I'm not doing this to keep people out. I'm doing it because I won't stand on another mountain and listen to people freeze, because nobody believed the cold could move faster than pride." Down in Cedar Hollow, while Ethan sat with memory pressing against his ribs, Clara Bennett was still awake inside the schoolhouse, wearing her winter coat at her desk because the old furnace had coughed twice and settled into a thin, tired hum that barely reached the back classroom. Across from her sat Evelyn Price, the chair of the town board, a woman in her early 60s with a neat silver bob, pearl earrings, and the composed voice of someone who had spent decades making painful decisions sound reasonable. Evelyn was not heartless, but years of budgets, declining enrollment, and repairs the town could not afford had made her practical in a way that often looked cruel to people still fighting for what she had already counted as lost. She slid a folder across Clara's desk and explained that the school would remain open through winter, but unless funding changed by spring, the board would vote to consolidate with Northfield Ridge, sending Cedar Hollow's children over the mountain road every morning before sunrise. Clara listened without interrupting, because teachers learned to hold themselves still while bad news moved through a room, but the words struck deeper than Evelyn could know. She imagined Lily Hollis and the other children waiting in darkness beside icy roads, imagined buses climbing the pass in weather adults always claimed would not be that bad until it was, imagined her father's old broom closet emptied and the classroom walls stripped bare, and for a moment the school seemed to become a body losing heat. "That road closes twice every winter," Clara said, keeping her voice calm, only by folding her hands tightly in her lap. Evelyn sighed and rubbed one temple. "Then we hope the county improves plowing." Clara looked toward the cracked window she had taped the night before and thought of Ethan Walker, studying the school roof, like a man, seeing not a building, but a shelter. And though she did not yet understand the wooden tunnels on Frostpine Hill, some part of her wondered whether the town was laughing at the only person already preparing for the kind of winter they refused to imagine. Before dawn, Ethan woke from a shallow sleep with Ranger standing at the cabin door, body rigid, ears high, and the low sound in his throat so controlled that it was more message than growl. Ethan dressed quickly, stepped outside into a blue-black morning, and felt the change at once. The wind had shifted during the night, no longer sliding cleanly along the ridge, but pushing down from the high cuts in uneven bursts that carried a mineral cold from the mountain face. Below the tree line, 3 deer moved across the slope far earlier than they should have, heads low, bodies tense, not grazing but leaving, and above them, a scatter of dark birds skimmed low between the spruces instead of rising into open air. Ranger moved to Ethan's side and stared toward the green mountains, nostrils working, tail held straight, every part of him, saying that the world had altered while men slept. Ethan stood in the frost with one hand on Ranger's back and watched the animals abandon the higher ground, watched chimney smoke in the valley flatten sideways, watched the clouds stack in a hard gray wall behind the peaks, and he no longer felt the question of whether the storm would come, only the heavier question of whether there was time to finish what Cedar Hollow still thought was madness. Behind him, the wooden frames waited in half-shadow, some circling the cabin, some covering the woodpile, some marked toward the school trail, where Clara was fighting a different kind of cold, the slow freezing of a town's heart around the place that held its children. Ethan picked up his hammer from the porch rail, and Ranger stepped forward before the command was given, because both of them understood the morning had become a countdown. "It's forming now," Ethan said quietly, eyes fixed on the mountains, and the wind answered by bending the pines all at once, as if the ridge itself had nodded. By the time morning opened over Frostpine Hill, the strange wall of clouds behind the green mountains had thickened into a hard gray ceiling, and Ethan Walker moved through the yard before most of Cedar Hollow had poured its first coffee, loading his pickup with a list written in pencil and marked by priority rather than convenience. Ranger stood beside the truck bed, 7 years old, sable-coated and broad through the chest, his black-masked face lifted into the wind, while his ears shifted toward every sound coming from the valley road, because the dog had read Ethan's urgency long before any person in town would admit there was urgency to read. Ethan needed more rope, steel nails, waterproof tarps, lantern fuel, medical wraps, antiseptic, thermal blankets, and pain relievers, not because he enjoyed seeing the number of worried faces grow, but because the deer had already left the upper slopes, the birds had flown low before sunrise, and the wind from the mountain cuts had begun moving in the wrong direction, carrying the kind of cold that did not belong to a mild forecast or a town still pretending winter was only a season printed on a calendar. The drive down from the cabin passed beneath branches that hung too still, and as Ethan guided the pickup along the gravel road, Ranger sat high in the passenger seat, like a sentry beside a commander, his amber eyes fixed forward, his body steady enough that anyone looking from the outside might have thought the dog was calm, though Ethan knew better. Calm was not the absence of danger. Calm was the discipline to move through danger without wasting motion. Cedar Hollow appeared below them in pieces. The white steeple, the post office, the diner with its fogged windows, Miller's Hardware with a row of snow shovels still displayed like decorations rather than necessities. And when Ethan parked at the curb, he saw heads turn inside the store before he even opened the truck door. The rumor had moved faster than the weather, and this morning it had found a crowd. Mark Hollis stood near the hardware entrance with a paper coffee cup in one hand and his other thumb hooked into the pocket of his work vest, his broad red face bright with the pleasure of having an audience, while beside him clustered 2 mechanics from the garage, a feed store clerk, and the same teenage boys who had filmed Ethan from the bend below the cabin. The taller boy was Tyler Mills, 16, all elbows and nervous swagger, with a narrow face, a black beanie pulled over sandy hair, and the kind of mouth that copied older men before it understood them, while the shorter one, Noah Crane, 15, round-cheeked and restless, held his phone chest high, as if the screen gave him courage his body had not earned yet. "Here he is," Mark called, loud enough for people inside the diner to look out. "The man of the hour, Cedar Hollow's own maze builder, coming down from Frostpine Hill for supplies before the aliens land." Laughter lifted along the storefronts, thin at first, then warmer as more people joined, and Ranger's body stiffened beside Ethan's leg. Not because he feared the laughter, but because he recognized the shift that came when a crowd forgot there was a person standing inside its joke. Ethan did not answer as he walked into Miller's Hardware, where Olivia Reed, the cashier, stood behind the counter, arranging boxes of nails with hands that moved a little too quickly. Olivia was 26, small-framed, with copper hair cut at her chin, freckles across her nose, and a cautious kindness that made her smile at everyone but never stay in any argument long enough to be blamed for it. Her mother had run the register before illness forced her home, and Olivia had learned early that in a town like Cedar Hollow, survival sometimes meant nodding at the loudest person while quietly helping the person who needed help most. "Morning, Mr. Walker," she said, her eyes dropping briefly to Ranger, then to the list in Ethan's hand. "Looks like you're stocking up." Ethan placed coils of rope, steel nails, waterproof tarps, 2 lanterns, medical gauze, antiseptic, and emergency blankets on the counter, and he heard Mark's voice through the open door before Olivia finished ringing them up, telling someone that the soldier on the hill was probably planning to tie the whole town together so nobody escaped his wooden tunnels. Outside, the laughter grew sharper when Ethan carried the supplies back to the truck, and Tyler raised his phone fully now, recording with the bright, hungry expression of a boy who believed attention was the same thing as importance. "Say something for the video, Mr. Walker," Tyler called. "Tell everybody how the Frostpine Maze is going to save us from light snow." Noah laughed behind him and added, "Maybe Ranger can lead tours." Ranger moved 1 step forward, quiet but absolute, and the boys stepped back at the same time, their smiles thinning. Ethan stopped beside the truck, one hand on the tailgate, and looked across the gathering without anger, because anger would only feed what they wanted. "You should get your wood off the ground," he said, his voice low enough that the crowd had to quiet to hear it. "Cover it properly, check your chimney draw, and keep emergency heat where you can reach it in the dark." Mark blew out a theatrical breath and turned to the others. Hear that? Now the maze builder is giving sermons. Clara Bennett stepped from the post office, carrying a folder of school notices against her chest, and the moment she saw the phone pointed at Ethan and the crowd gathered too close, her expression changed from tired concern to controlled disappointment. Clara was not large, and she did not raise her voice often, but she had spent years standing in front of restless children, grieving parents, and a town board that could make neglect sound practical. And when she spoke, people listened before remembering they had planned not to. "That's enough," she said, looking first at Tyler's phone, then at Mark. Cedar Hollow used to be proud of helping neighbors before laughing at them. Mark shrugged, uncomfortable only because Clara's words carried the weight of someone everyone knew had given more to the town than she had received from it. "We're just having fun," he said. Clara's eyes moved to Ethan's rope and tarps, then to the heavy sky above the rooftops. "Fun is what children have at recess," she said. "This is adults teaching children how to mock a man for preparing." For a moment, the crowd shifted under the truth of that, but truth did not hold long against pride, and Mark recovered first with an awkward chuckle, saying Clara had always been too soft for her own good. Ethan loaded the last tarp into the truck and turned toward Sheriff Daniel Brooks, who had just pulled up in his cruiser at the far curb, his gray mustache damp from the cold and his tired blue eyes moving from the teenagers to Clara, then to Ethan, with the weary resignation of a man who had hoped the day might pass without choosing a side. "Daniel," Ethan said before the sheriff could begin, "pressure is dropping too fast. The wind is coming down from the cuts, instead of lifting off the valley, and the animals have already moved lower than they should. This won't be light snow." Daniel glanced toward the ridge, then back at Ethan, and although he did not laugh, his face held the careful restraint of a public man, surrounded by people who wanted reassurance more than accuracy. "Weather Service is calling for a minor system, Ethan. Some snow, maybe a little ice, nothing we haven't handled." Ethan held his gaze. "They're wrong." Daniel rubbed his gloved thumb along the edge of his belt and lowered his voice, but not far enough to keep the nearby crowd from leaning in. "I'll keep an eye on it, and I'll mention it in the afternoon update, but I can't put the town on alert because one man reads the wind differently from the forecast." Ranger's ears flattened slightly, as if the dog heard not the words, but the danger beneath them, and Ethan felt the old pressure building under his ribs, the memory of commanders trusting reports while the mountain sharpened its teeth around them. "Then tell people to check heat and dry fuel," Ethan said. "Tell them to secure sheds and bring elderly neighbors somewhere warmer before dark if the ice comes in hard." Daniel nodded once, more promise than action, and said he would make a note, but Ethan could already see how small that note would become once it passed through a station radio, a town used to mild inconveniences, and a forecast that had given everyone permission not to be afraid. While Ethan drove back toward Frostpine Hill, Clara crossed to Cedar Hollow Elementary and found the problems waiting for her, like old debts that had learned to hide in plain sight. The main furnace coughed when she turned the thermostat, then rattled through the walls with a tired metallic groan that made the floorboards tremble, and the backwood bin behind the school, the one meant to feed the emergency classroom stove, sat beneath a leaking awning, where last night's ice had melted through the cracked shingles and soaked the top layer of logs. She called the board office first, then Mark's Hardware, then two parents who had promised earlier in the year they could help with repairs, but each answer sounded the same in different voices. People were busy. People assumed the storm would pass. People had their own homes to check. People could look at it next week. Clara stood behind the school with cold water darkening the cuffs of her gloves and felt a sick heaviness settle in her chest. Because the building she had fought to save had heat that might fail, fuel that might not burn, and a town too distracted by laughing at Ethan Walker to understand that preparation was not paranoia when children were involved. By late afternoon, Ethan was back on Frostpine Hill, driving steel nails through cross braces, while Ranger patrolled the edge of the clearing with increasing tension, and the new supplies disappeared into order. Rope anchored along the covered runs, tarps folded beneath the wood shelter, medical packs placed in a crate near the cabin door, lanterns checked and filled, blankets stacked where a half-frozen hand could find them without thinking. From the ridge, Cedar Hollow looked peaceful in the dimming light, but peace could be a camera angle, nothing more, because Ethan saw the smoke flattening over the rooftops, saw clouds sliding down like a lid, and saw the first flakes appear against the dark pines, not as soft white points, but as hard slanted flecks driven sideways by a sudden burst of wind. Ranger stopped at the same instant, head lifting, mouth closed, body still. The flakes struck Ethan's jacket with the tiny sharp sound of thrown sand, and then more came, fast, glittering, wrong. He looked toward the trail leading down to Clara's school, then back at Ranger, whose low growl rolled beneath the rising wind, and Ethan said, quietly, "It's coming earlier than they think." The next gust hit the half-built tunnel hard enough to make the tarps snap like sails, and as the first true snow of the season came not falling but cutting sideways through Cedar Hollow, Ethan tightened his grip on the hammer and added, "Sooner than we thought, buddy." The first snow did not soften Cedar Hollow into winter. It attacked it, coming sideways over the green mountains in hard white sheets that hissed against windows, slapped against porch rails, and turned the roads into blank scars before people had time to understand that the forecast had failed them. By nightfall, the town that had laughed outside Miller's Hardware was losing its shape beneath ice, the church steeple fading behind wind-driven snow, the diner sign flickering once before going dark, and the narrow road up Frostpine Hill disappearing so completely that even the fence posts looked like ghosts trying to find their way home. Ethan Walker stood inside his cabin with the lanterns lit, his steel-gray eyes moving from the window to the emergency crate, from the rope line anchored to the wall to the covered wooden passages outside, while Ranger stood beside the door with his sable coat dusted in frost from their last check of the tunnel braces, his black-masked face lifted toward the valley, as if the entire town had become a sound only he could hear. Down in Cedar Hollow, the storm found every weakness people had ignored, and one by one, those weaknesses broke under the weight of ice. Wood shelters built from thin boards folded inward, leaving stacked logs exposed to sleet until they drank water like sponges. Backyard tarps tore free and vanished into the dark. Generators sputtered when wet fuel lines froze, and families who had planned on an ordinary cold night found themselves holding damp kindling over weak flames that smoked more than burned. At Cedar Hollow Elementary, Clara Bennett had opened the school doors before anyone officially told her to, wearing her wool coat over a sweater, her chestnut braid tucked beneath a knit cap. Her calm teacher's voice stretched tight but steady as she moved desks aside, laid blankets on classroom floors, and coaxed the old furnace to cough out what little heat it had left. She knew the building was not ready, knew the back wood bin was damp, knew the board had delayed too long. Yet she also knew that if the school closed its doors tonight, frightened children and elderly neighbors would have nowhere lower, flatter, and safer to gather. Ethan was tightening the final knot on the interior lifeline when Ranger went rigid, his ears rising so sharply that Ethan stopped breathing for a second and listened past the cabin walls, past the storm beating at the roof, past the groan of the pines. At first there was only wind, a freight train roar sliding across the ridge. But then Ranger gave a short, urgent bark and turned toward the lower road, where the covered guide path sloped in the direction of the school. Ethan heard it then, thin and almost lost between gusts, not the crack of wood or the snap of branches, but a child crying. He moved before thought had fully formed, tying the rope around his waist, clipping a second line to Ranger's harness, pulling his hood low, and giving the command in the same low voice that had once cut through smoke, dust, and battlefield noise. "Find." Ranger lunged into the storm with controlled force, not running wildly, but driving forward with his nose low and his body angled against the wind, while Ethan followed the pull of the rope into a world where white erased distance, and every breath felt like swallowing needles. They found Lily Hollis near the road below the school, half buried where the drift had curled against the ditch, her small body folded around a bundle of useless wet sticks, her pink winter coat crusted with snow, her dark blonde hair frozen against her cheeks, and her eyes wide with the stunned fear of a child who had gone out to help and discovered the world had changed too quickly. Lily was 9, serious and quiet in Clara's classroom, known for drawing clouds in the margins of her papers and for trying too hard to be brave when adults were worried. And now her lips trembled as she whispered that Daddy needed wood, that their fire would not catch, that she had thought the school lights were closer. Ethan dropped to one knee, wrapped her inside his coat as much as he could, and lifted her carefully while Ranger circled them, barking short and sharp to keep her conscious. "You stay with me, Lily," Ethan said, his voice steady even as the wind shoved hard against his back. "Your father can yell at me later. Right now, you breathe." The covered wooden guide path did not stop the storm, but it gave the storm something to fail against, because the low frame Ethan had built along the worst drift line kept part of the route from vanishing entirely, and the rope beneath it gave his gloved hand a truth to follow when sight became useless. Ethan carried Lily toward the school instead of the cabin, because Clara's building was closer and lower, and when he pushed through the front doors with Ranger at his heel, Clara turned from a circle of shivering children and went pale before she moved into action. She took Lily into her arms, wrapped her in blankets, and called for warm water, while several parents stared at Ethan with the first cracks of understanding opening in their faces. Before anyone could ask questions, Ranger barked again, deeper this time, toward the north side of town, and Ethan looked at Clara only long enough to say, "Keep her warm. I'm going back out." The second rescue was Margaret Lewis, the sharp-eyed widow who had slowed her red Subaru on Ethan's first day, now collapsed beside her own porch steps after slipping on ice while trying to bring in one last armful of wood. Margaret was thin beneath her heavy coat, her gray hair loose around a face made hard by years of managing grief alone, but her hand still clutched 2 pieces of firewood as if letting go would mean admitting she could no longer care for herself. Ranger reached her first, pressing his warm body against her side and whining low until Ethan found them through the blowing snow. "I told Samuel I'd never need rescuing on my own porch," Margaret breathed, embarrassed even while her teeth chattered, and Ethan answered without judgment, "Then, blame me, ma'am, not yourself," as he secured the rope around her waist and helped her through the partial tunnel line toward the school, where Clara met them at the door with blankets, and the kind of fierce relief that made her eyes shine without spilling tears. The third call came from a house near the creek, where a pine had gone down across the chimney of the Miller family home, and smoke had begun backing into the living room, while ice pinned the back door shut. The Millers had not been central to any rumor, only ordinary people caught by an extraordinary night. Grace Miller, 32, tall and dark-haired, a nurse's aide with tired eyes and a habit of speaking gently even when frightened. Her husband Ben, 35, broad, bearded, and stubborn with the shame of a man who hated needing help, and their son Owen, 6, small, red-cheeked, and coughing into the sleeve of his dinosaur pajamas, while his parents tried to guide him through the front entrance beneath a porch awning sagging under snow. Ethan ordered them toward the rope line, but as Owen stumbled, a section of the overloaded awning cracked loose above him. Ranger saw it first, launching forward with a sharp bark and driving his shoulder into the boy's side hard enough to push him clear, just as the frozen edge came down and struck the dog's hind leg with a sound Ethan felt in his own bones. For one terrifying moment, the storm seemed to fall silent around Ethan, because Ranger was on his side in the snow, breathing fast, his injured leg tucked at a wrong angle, his amber eyes still locked on Owen, as if making sure the boy had survived. Ethan dropped beside him, one hand sliding under the dog's chest, the other steadying the hurt leg, and the controlled soldier in him fought the broken man, rising beneath his ribs. "I've got you, buddy," he whispered, pressing his forehead briefly to Ranger's. "You did it. You saved him," Ranger whimpered once, then licked Ethan's glove as if comforting him, and that small, loyal gesture struck harder than the ice. Ethan lifted the dog carefully, ordering Ben and Grace to keep one hand on the rope and one hand on Owen, and together they moved through the white toward Cedar Hollow Elementary, each step slow, brutal, and necessary. By the time Ethan carried Ranger through the school doors, the building had become what Clara had always believed it could be. Not just classrooms and cracked windows, but a heart still beating when the rest of Cedar Hollow had gone dark. Families huddled along the walls under coats and blankets. Children sat in circles near lanterns. Margaret Lewis rested near the furnace. Lily Hollis slept wrapped in 2 quilts with her damp hair drying against Clara's scarf, and the Millers were pulled inside by hands that only hours earlier might have held phones to laugh at Ethan's strange construction. Outside, the wooden tunnels and rope lines had kept enough pathways open for people to move between the dry wood Ethan had protected, the schoolhouse, and the nearest homes, and now the shape of the thing everyone had mocked became visible in their faces. It was not a maze. It was a lifeline. Mark Hollis arrived last, stumbling through the door with snow in his beard, his face raw from wind and fear, his broad shoulders bent as if the storm had aged him in a single hour. He saw Lily asleep, saw Ranger lying injured on a folded blanket near Ethan's knees, saw the dry wood stacked by the classroom stove beneath one of Ethan's waterproof tarps, and whatever joke had once lived in him broke apart before it could reach his mouth. He sank down beside his daughter, touched her hair with a shaking hand, then turned toward Ethan with tears cutting clean lines through the frost on his face. "I laughed at you," Mark said, his voice cracking in front of the people who had laughed with him. "I called you crazy, and my little girl would be gone if you and that dog hadn't hurt her." Ethan kept one hand on Ranger's shoulder, feeling the dog breathe, feeling the room wait for anger, forgiveness, anything that would make the shame easier to carry, but he only looked at Mark, then at Clara, then at the frightened town gathered inside the school, and said in a low, steady voice, "Apologies can wait. Tonight, we keep people alive." And the moment Ethan Walker said that apologies could wait, Cedar Hollow Elementary changed from a frightened shelter into a command post, not because anyone voted for it, not because Sheriff Daniel Brooks finally found the perfect words, but because survival had a way of stripping a room down to what mattered, and every person inside that old schoolhouse could see Ethan kneeling beside injured Ranger, with one hand on the dog's shoulder and the other, already reaching for the map Clara Bennett had pinned beside the chalkboard. Outside, the ice storm still hammered the town with a sound like gravel poured over sheet metal, and the windows shuddered in their frames while children slept in uneven bundles beneath coats. But Ethan's voice stayed low, steady, and clear as he divided the room into tasks, sending able-bodied adults toward the rope lines, assigning 2 parents to keep the classroom stoves fed, placing Margaret Lewis near the younger children, because even shaken and exhausted, the sharp-eyed widow still knew how to calm a crying child with a firm hand and a warmer blanket. Clara moved beside him without needing to be told twice, her chestnut braid damp from melted snow, her face pale with exhaustion, but her brown eyes focused. And in that moment she looked less like a teacher fighting a school closure and more like the keeper of a lighthouse during a Black Sea storm. She turned the East classroom into a warming room, the West classroom into a sleeping area, and the small nurse's corner into a first aid station, laying out gauze, antiseptic, dry socks, thermometers, and the emergency supplies Ethan had bought that morning, while the same town had laughed at him outside the hardware store. Lily Hollis slept near the chalkboard wrapped in quilts. Owen Miller leaned against his mother Grace, with a cup of warm water between his hands, and Ben Miller, still ashamed that a wounded dog had saved his son, stood silently beside the door, waiting for orders. Ranger lay on a folded blanket near the entryway, his injured hind leg wrapped as best Ethan could manage. Yet even in pain, the 7-year-old German Shepherd kept his ears lifted toward the storm, refusing to surrender his post, as if the schoolhouse were now his perimeter, and every life inside belonged under his watch. Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived through the front doors half an hour later, with snow packed into the seams of his coat, his gray mustache crusted white, and his tired blue eyes, carrying the look of a man who had finally heard truth, arrived too late to be comfortable. He had spent the last hour moving between failed generators, frozen radios, blocked roads, and households burning wet wood that smoked instead of heated, and when he saw the dry logs stacked beneath Ethan's tarp, the rope lines leading back into the storm, and the people already alive because Ethan's strange wooden tunnels had held open routes the town itself had not prepared, whatever official distance remained in him fell away. "You were right," Daniel said, loud enough for the room to hear, and his voice did not defend itself or soften the admission. "I should have warned them sooner." Ethan looked at him only briefly, because blame could wait as long as apology could, then pointed toward the map and said they needed 2 teams, one to pull dry firewood from the protected shed on Frostpine Hill, another to bring the elderly and children from the nearest cold homes along the guide ropes before the second wind band sealed the roads completely. Mark Hollis stepped forward before anyone asked, his broad face still streaked from tears and melted frost, his seed company cap gone somewhere in the storm, leaving his thinning brown hair plastered flat against his head. Hours earlier, he had been the loudest laugh in Cedar Hollow, but now his voice had lost all performance. "Put me on the sled," he said, looking from Ethan to Ranger, and then toward Lily, who stirred beneath the blankets without waking. Ethan studied him long enough to make sure shame had become resolve instead of panic, then nodded. Daniel took the second rope team. Ben Miller joined Mark on the wood crew, and Olivia Reed from the hardware store, small-framed and copper-haired, quietly handed Ethan an extra box of nails she had brought from the store before the power died. saying she should have spoken up sooner when the crowd started mocking him. Ethan accepted the box without ceremony, because tonight regret was useful only if it carried something warm, dry, or strong enough to hold. They moved into the storm in staggered lines, Ethan in front with the main rope around his waist, Mark and Ben behind him pulling the wooden sled that Ethan had built for exactly this kind of night, while Daniel led a second group along the lower tunnel path toward the homes nearest the creek. The wooden frames groaned under the weight of ice, but they held, their low roofs breaking the worst of the wind, and their guide ropes sliding through gloved hands like veins of certainty inside a world gone blind. Every few yards, Ethan checked the braces, tightened a knot, cleared snow from a support, then kept moving, because the dry wood stored beneath his protected shed was no longer his supply, no longer proof of a fear no one believed, but the town's heat, the town's breath, the town's chance to make it until morning. Mark pulled until his shoulders shook. Ben stumbled and rose again, and behind them, the sled filled with split maple, lantern fuel, rolled blankets, and one sealed crate of medical supplies Ethan had placed there before anyone understood why. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara became the center of everything, directing parents to carry logs to the stoves, asking older children to pass blankets down the rows, sending hot water to Margaret's corner, and recording names on the chalkboard so no family would be lost in the confusion. Evelyn Price, the town board chair who had once explained the school's closure in practical sentences, arrived with two neighbors and stood frozen near the entrance for a moment, her neat silver bob hidden beneath a soaked hood, her pearl earrings absurdly delicate against a night that had made every budget argument feel small. She watched Clara turn the old building into a living shelter, watched children sleep safely beneath paper snowflakes taped to cracked windows, watched Ranger lift his head at each new arrival, despite his pain, and her composed face trembled as she whispered that if this building had been closed already, Cedar Hollow would have had nowhere to gather. Clara did not answer harshly, though she could have. She simply handed Evelyn a stack of blankets and said, "Then help me keep it open tonight." Near dawn, the storm began to weaken, not end, not forgive, but loosen its grip enough for the first gray light to press against the windows and reveal a town battered but breathing. The last sled of firewood reached the school just as the eastern sky turned pale behind the green mountains, and Ethan stepped inside with ice on his beard, his hands stiff, his shoulders trembling from the long night of pulling, lifting, bracing, and guiding people through whiteout. Daniel reported every household checked along the main route. Clara counted names twice. Mark held Lily in his arms and cried without hiding it this time. And Margaret Lewis, wrapped in a blanket near the stove, said in a voice dry but full of feeling that Samuel Walker would have liked seeing his old place used to save fools who had not known they needed saving. No one in Cedar Hollow died that night, and when that truth finally settled over the room, it did not erupt into cheers. It moved quietly from face to face, heavier than celebration, deeper than relief, because everyone understood how close the cold had come. By afternoon, the town board gathered in the same schoolhouse they had nearly abandoned, with families still sleeping in classrooms and wet coats hanging from chairbacks, and Evelyn Price stood before them without the safe language of budgets or consolidation. She admitted the old school had become the one place Cedar Hollow could depend on when the storm took power, heat, roads, and pride, and she proposed not only keeping it open, but making it the town's official winter shelter, with reinforced storage, emergency heat, and a permanent survival plan designed with Ethan's help. Daniel supported it, Mark supported it, Clara stood very still as the vote passed, and for a moment, she lowered her head, not in defeat this time, but in the exhausted gratitude of someone who had carried a place alone until the town finally helped lift it. Ethan stayed near the doorway with Ranger, who rested but watched, and when children crossed the room one by one to touch the dog's head gently, he accepted their small hands with quiet dignity, as if he knew the school had been saved along with the people inside it. Spring came months later with sawdust in the air and sunlight sliding over Cedar Hollow, like warmth returning to a body that had survived fever. Ethan taught the town how to build cold survival frames around homes, woodsheds, school paths, and exposed walkways, explaining snow load, airflow, anchor points, rope lines, and tarp angles in the same calm voice he had used during the storm, while Mark worked harder than anyone, sometimes joking softly about being the first fool converted by a wooden tunnel. Clara opened a winter survival program for her students, teaching them how to recognize unsafe cold, how to stay together in whiteout, how to find guide ropes by touch, and how preparation could be an act of love rather than fear. Ranger healed fully under Ethan's careful watch and became the most beloved figure in town, receiving biscuits from Margaret's porch, drawings from Lily and Owen, and a ridiculous blue scarf from Olivia that he tolerated for one afternoon before dragging it proudly through mud, which made the children laugh harder than they had laughed all winter. By early summer, 12 new survival frames stood across Cedar Hollow, each one built by neighbors who had once mistaken preparation for madness and now understood it as responsibility. The old schoolhouse had fresh roof flashing, a reinforced wood shelter, labeled emergency shelves, and a painted sign near the entrance that read Cedar Hollow Winter Shelter, though most people simply called it Clara's place because she had kept its doors open before anyone else believed it mattered. One evening, as the sun lowered behind Frostpine Hill and turned the valley windows gold, Ethan stood above town beside the first wooden tunnel he had built, watching children run near the schoolyard, while adults stacked wood under new roofs and smoke rose cleanly from chimneys that had learned to mean comfort again. Ranger stood beside him, strong on all four legs, his sable coat bright in the spring light, and when the dog leaned his head into Ethan's hand, Ethan allowed himself the small smile that had once felt impossible. "Mission accomplished, old friend," he said softly, and below them Cedar Hollow glowed like a town no longer waiting to be rescued by luck, because the people had become a community again. The school had become its shelter, the soldier on the hill had become one of their own, and winter would never catch them unprepared again. The lesson of this story is that sometimes God sends help in a form we do not understand at first. Cedar Hollow laughed at Ethan and Ranger because they could only see strange wooden tunnels, but God saw preparation, protection, and a miracle waiting for the right moment. In our daily lives, we often judge people too quickly, ignore quiet warnings, or laugh at things that look different from what we expect. But this story reminds us that faith, wisdom, and kindness can save lives before the storm even arrives. Ethan did not build those shelters for praise, and Ranger did not run into the snow for reward. They did it because love protects, courage serves, and God often works through ordinary hands, loyal hearts, and silent sacrifices. May this story remind you to prepare your home, protect your family, listen before judging, and never underestimate the person God may place in your life for a reason. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about the lesson you received, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of loyalty, faith, survival, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every storm you are facing right now. If you believe that God still sends miracles through brave people and faithful companions, comment Amen.